Okay, so in this video we're going to go through creating just a mound of rubble. So this is something that you would add to an existing sort of scene. You may have already an existing mound, or maybe you were going to add it into the piece. But the idea is to be able to create lots of different variation through this. And right now this is only 2K. Could go up to 4K and see a lot of this detail a little bit sharper. But we're going to run through the general thought process behind it, and perhaps you can come up with a way to refine it further, or perhaps there will be a node in the near future that will just kind of do this automatically. One of the thought processes that you have to consider with many of these things, because they're procedurally generated, the more chaos you can introduce, the more realism it will add to the piece. Now, there's another aspect to Gaea Talus that you should also consider, in that some of the pieces have to be sort of settled on the surface. They can't kind of all be implanted. So this would look even better if it had some rocks scattered on the surface. Say if you're using Unreal or Maya or one of those other tools, you could have a bunch of little rocks that you then scatter on top that are all instanced all over the surface, and that will just improve the overall quality. So starting off, I just wanted something simple, so I start off with a very simple gradient. I take that and run it through Gamma because I wanted the mound to be a little bit rounder instead of peaked. Went through landform quickly just to get me some shape, and then a quick bias gain to shorten it a little bit, and then a tiny bit of erosion. So I did the default erosion, but I dropped its influence, and again just for the purposes of creating some different forms in there. So it created some little hills and a few additional carve-ins. Then I wanted to add a little bit more rough shape to this, and I wanted to start working on the rocks. So a lot of where I start my rocks is always Voronoi. You want big rocks, medium rocks, small rocks. And so you work your way through this. With Voronoi, scale all the way up in all settings. I got rid of the perturb settings, so the deformation for it, it's just set to none, and it's all gone. Bring the influence down so that it's not terribly high, otherwise they're just these huge spikes. So just taking that influence down, and something that I can kind of work with. I still need some height here to work with, but I don't want all of it. Now, on this level, I'm just going to take this just kind of as is, and run a landform on it. Landform is just going to rough it up and kind of move it all over the place. Erode it a tiny bit, and I'll just combine that in with my original. So taking this and then combining it with that as screen, and then choosing the mount that I want. So this gives me sort of the idea of maybe a sandy kind of mound. I could make this a softer sandy mound by blurring it and then going with aperture. So if you wanted to do a mound of sand and then add a few rocks into it, then you could do that as well. And we'll see something similar to that over here, where I go ahead and I blur it, and then the aperture creates those ripples. So you can do that if you wanted to. But this was fine for me. Some of these will be interpreted as rocks, and some of it will be interpreted as just ground detail. So this works out just fine. So the other thing that I want to do with these is I'm going to run it through a bias gain. And the bias gain is going to be used with intensity and bias to bring them downwards. So just kind of throw them underneath. The thing that you have to be aware of when you're dealing with bias and gain is that even though you see values come below the bottom, this is still keeping them. So often cases, even if you're not going to do anything with this particular one, I do in this case, but even if you're not going to, you need to clip it. So I take this and set it to clip. In this particular case, I'm also chopping the tops of them a little bit, so I get sort of squared off shapes for some of the rocks. But I also then still use the points that are here by running it through this one, which is just set to clip and nothing else. And all this is set to do is that anything that's below the ground right now is completely eliminated. It's gone. Because if you go and combine them back, without doing that, from a bias and gain, all the information that's gone into the negative values will still be there. And there's reasons why you may still want to use those negative values. So it's not something that you should consider to be a bug. It's not. There will be reasons to have those lower values. Anyways, moving along. So I've got the one set that I send off, and I got the other set that is chopped. I run a little bit of a displace on it to move them around. Really didn't need it, but it added a little extra variation to the shape. Everything looked a little bit even when I was looking at it from the top, but I'm not sure if it really reads once I put it on anyways, so it's up to you to decide, if you feel it's worth the time and effort. So I've got that, and those are my some of my larger rocks. I want to get some smaller rocks, so I go through the constant, apply noise, which is going to give me lots of little pebbles, but I don't really want those. I want to go up a size from that. So I can only go so small with Voronoi without having it all really spread out, and I can only go so far with this. So another trick that you can do is you can actually apply a small amount of blur to it. Now this, of course, doesn't look correct, but if we go ahead and auto level that, and then bring that auto level down, we start to see bigger peaks. The noise pattern kind of increases in size. If we were to go ahead and aperture that, we get some breakup there. Bias and gain, again, to drop that base, and then a clip to eliminate the negative values. Over here, small scattering of pebbles, again, bias gain, same thing, just keeping the tips as was without having to use aperture, and then clipping those and then combining them together so I get a whole bunch of them. Then I'm going to combine them with my big rocks, just like this, setting it to max 100%. So I've got a whole bunch of these now. Now, my initial settings, playing with this with Bomber, seem to look okay once I combine it in anyways. But I want to point out just that in some of these sections here, it doesn't look quite right. So Bomber here is taking this texture and it's scattering it all over the place. So it's giving me a whole bunch of smaller rocks off of that. Part of the reason I have this second one going off is because it brings back some of those bigger rocks. These kinds of rocks, right? So Bomber is scattering it all over the place. First thing you want to do, of course, is take the strength all up, and then for this one I needed to bring the density down, and I got something like this. And I could probably even drop it even further. You could play with the minimum scale, maximum scale to change how small these other rocks can get. But as I said, when I combined it in, it looked pretty good at 2K anyways. I can check it again at 4K if I want to wait for it to build. And that would be something that I would tweak. So going from this to this, I wanted to add those big rocks in. Adding the big rocks to make sure that they work in max, so they're not influenced by all this noise detail. So you see all these individual points. If I try and add back in these other rock shapes, they're going to add into the noise pattern that is here. I won't get these very distinctive chunks that I'm getting here, and I want to have those. So for these new ones I'm adding in, what I'm doing is I'm taking this original shape, I'm softening it, and I'm using a certain amount of blur. By doing that, I'm eliminating a lot of the noise pattern that's here. Once I combine that, you'll notice that they maintain their detail and shape a little bit better. Making use of aperture is going to shrink them a little bit. It's going to sharpen some of these things, but it also pulls in the forms a little bit. When I blurred this without the aperture, I intend to connect it here via max. And what will happen is some of those areas that are blurred out will start to peek through, and they'll soften sections of my terrain, so I didn't want that. So the aperture effectively shrinks it along its normal, so pushes it in. That way the only thing that will peek out is the stuff that's sticking out here. So by using max in this way, I don't have the issue of these things becoming deformed with the noise. They just kind of peek out through. Another aspect of what I'm doing here is in the combination of this to add my noise. You notice it's not adding to everywhere. I ran a snow on this, and the snow's only job is to generate the mask. I'm not actually using the form it creates. I am, however, using the mask, and you can control melt and whatnot to control areas where the talus shows up most frequently. So the big rocks, I didn't mask them off. They just kind of go all over the place, which makes sense. So that's it for creating the actual shape, the initial form. That's what I wanted. Once you get down to the actual process of, picking out these individual pieces and coloring them, there's a number of ways that I can go about it. I can use different masks to isolate the individual noise patterns from the original form if I wanted those to be different, or I can just process it as is and try and use the shape to the best of its ability. So that's what I decided to do for this run. Often cases I will extract certain rocks and whatnot in order to color them differently, but in this particular case we're just going to go with what's here. Surfacer, I'm setting it to peaks, and what it's doing is it's picking out the sharp peaks that it finds all over the place. So it's picking out rocks, and in particular the part of the rock that sticks out the most. So it will help me emphasize that a little bit. I use it twice, once to control a sat map, which is giving me some color variation. Not a lot of value variation, but just overall saturation. So I've got little gray areas and a more saturated kind of browns and tans in there, and so it just gives lots of variation in saturation. And that's great. I use it a second time running it through a color node where I wanted to emphasize those peaks more from everything else, but bring some color back in. So that's added back in a little bit afterwards. So that's that one. Soil. This goes in and digs out some crevices. Again, running it through a sat maps and using that to emphasize again. It's picking up areas like ridges. So soil is finding a lot of the ridges for me and a lot of the pockets, and that gives some interesting variation. By combining it together with this, now I've got those saturation and variation in there, and I've got the ridges and pockets kind of isolated. Here I also have a surfacer trace with an increased strength. This is picking out ridges even sharper, so it's picking out the very sharp edges all over the place and has a gradient through to the softer areas. Again, running that through sat maps, choosing something that gave me, again, significant variation. So it's going from light to dark, but there's a lot of variation in there, so I'll add some complication to the surface. Adding that to my initial setup here, we get here, and then I wanted to add that emphasis that I was talking about back in for those pieces, so we go to here. And that's just making all the bits of rock really kind of show up. So it's just layering and layering and layering. Now I wanted to emphasize some shape and flow to this, and of course the way to pick that up is just to go ahead and generate a flow map. I ran that through sat maps, again, something that would isolate the difference between where the flow area was and the other one, but still bring a little bit of color back in. And I mix that in as blend in a small amount. The end result is lots of little variations all throughout, and just like the generation of the talus, by bringing these little variations all the way through the entire form, you get something that feels a little bit natural, because nature, let's face it, is essentially chaotic. It's got lots of tiny little things. So this is my approach to that, is just adding lots of little bits and pieces. And sometimes, you can go from node to node to node to node and not really get much out of it. But that experimentation process initially will start to give you an idea of what in there has the most impact. How can I refine that back? And you go back, you delete a whole bunch of nodes, and you kind of put it back in together with less nodes and get something more refined. That way you save on time with regards to the amount of time that it takes to build things, and also in your build process, so that you have a better end form. Now, this is to force everything in a more procedural sense. I could have skipped a lot of this simply by just jumping directly to Bomber and coming up with 2 sets or 3 sets of rock patterns that you could generate from other software, be it Substance Designer, or maybe ZBrush. You go ahead and sculpt a bunch of things, or in Maya or 3 Studio Max or Cinema 4D, where you're scatting a whole bunch of things on a plane and you use that for height map information. And you could just plug them into different bombers and combine them together, and you would skip a lot of this initial step. You don't have to do everything procedural in here. You can pull height map information, maybe even photogrammetry or grammetry details. Go out and take some photos of chunks of rock, and then take them back into something like Substance Designer to make it seamless, and then use Bomber to kind of scatter it all over the place. In the case of using it with Bomber, you may want to do something like zero borders is another possibility. Here I didn't have to, but you can use zero borders to break it up so that it's little pods of talus. Lots of ideas. So hopefully you've gained something interesting from this. You have an idea of how you can approach making sort of detailed rock piles. And I'll see you in the next video.